welcome back to What Christians Believe. I am E-Man.
And I am Pastor Dan.
And today in episode 7, I believe it is, we're going to talk about the reliability of the Bible.
Okay, good topic.
Now, we both agree that the Bible is not meant to be an analogy or a mythology.
Right, yes, okay. My belief is the Bible's true.
Correct.
Yes.
So when you read about, this guy goes to this town, the king at that time is this guy, it literally means it.
Yeah.
And so therefore there should be evidence of that outside the Bible.
Yes.
Correct. Now, if we're going to focus in on Exodus and the archaeological evidence of the story of Exodus, can you walk us through the basics of the story of Exodus and maybe some of the theological implications?
Sure. And I think we've got a good 5 hours of recording time going here, so that shouldn't take long at all. Then walk us through the Exodus.
Just do it in a pithy form.
Yeah. Okay, so the Exodus, well, I don't know what we're going to do, because you got to kind of go back to Joseph, right? Joseph had been sold into slavery to Egypt, lived most of his life there. When the famine came, there was a great famine coming in the land. Joseph was in a position of power in Egypt, and he basically saved Egypt by planning for famine after great years of plenty. They had storehouses full of food when the famine hit. And
So hold on, let me stop you right there.
Sure.
Because what I'll do is I'll fill in the archaeological evidence for what you say as you say it.
Okay.
So there has to be, at some point, there should be evidence of the arrival of a Semitic type of people in Egypt.
I don't know if there's evidence of the arrival, but there certainly is evidence of their existence in Egypt.
Yes, correct.
Yes.
There should be evidence of the arrival and then the spread of a Semitic people.
Yeah.
There should also be evidence of a wealth transfer around the time of those events.
A wealth transfer at the time of those events.
Because remember what happened to when the famine hit, and Joseph had the Pharaoh prepare storehouses of grain. The regional rulers and peoples had to come to them to buy it. Spent all their money at first, then sold all their cattle, and after that, when they ran out of cattle, they sold all their land to the Pharaoh.
Okay, yeah.
So there just happens to be evidence of that.
Yeah, it's a pretty big deal.
It is. Therefore, we should expect to find it. So what happens is you have there's an area north of Cairo where the Nile starts the northern delta.
The delta,
of Egypt. And at some point, in the Middle Kingdom, there is evidence of Semitic peoples beginning to grow in number there. And we know that because the burial practices in the sedimentary layer, older than the city of Ramses, in the same area that we hear about the city of Ramses in Exodus, it used to be called Avaris.
Okay.
And there's two basic epochs of that. So the older one is Avaris. In the time of Avaris, you have the obvious burial of Semitic type people. So the fact that they bury themselves with their animals, such as their donkeys, the type of weapons they're buried with, the type of pottery they have, those were non-Egyptian people. And they made up the wealthy merchant class for the first 100 or so years. And they grow in number at that time. So now we have in the archaeological record the city of Avaris, which is where the city of Ramses eventually was built hundreds of years later.
Yeah.
And in that time, we see the arrival of the Semitic peoples. And
do we have dates for any of this? Like, what years are we talking about here?
That's going to get interesting. Because what happens is they're having to recalibrate. The dating for that whole region, the Mediterranean region, the Palestinian region, and the North African region, aka Egypt, all revolve around the estimated dates of Egypt. They calibrate everything in the region of that time around that. And there's a very curious phenomenon that we'll discuss later.
Okay.
Now, there's a place near the Nile, a huge irrigation channel known as the Waterway of Joseph.
Okay.
It's still known to this day as that. And at that time, the Pharaoh Amenhotep Amenhat, he is buried there as well by the Waterway of Joseph. And there's in the record of the Egyptian archaeological record, around his time, regional rulers who were very wealthy, power was very decentralized at that time. Around his time, the local regional rulers lost wealth and power, and it all centralized to one guy, Pharaoh Amenhotep. Now, in this area, you see there's a city, one of the Semitic cities. One of the houses was built as a typical Syrophoenician style. Then it's immediately squashed, and in its place is erected a palatial. In all these Semitic buildings in this region in Egypt, there's one palace-style building in the middle of it. And it has 12 pillars, and these pillars are not just weight-bearing, they're ceremonial. And there's 12 of them. In the courtyard of, so it's obviously in this Semitic region of Egypt, is a official Egyptian palatial estate.
Okay.
But what are Egyptians doing living amongst the Semitic people? They didn't. And you have this 12-pillar building, and then there's 12 tombs in the courtyard. One of which is in the style of an Egyptian royalty. It's a pyramid style. All the other ones are normal. There's an Egyptian style pyramid, and there's a statue inside of it of a non-Egyptian person, and they're depicted with reddish hair and yellow skin, which was their depiction of non-Semitic people. Non-Egyptian.
Yep.
The northern people they call, which would have been the Palestinian Syrophoenician area.
Yeah.
That person's got a multicolored coat. No remain. Egyptian custom is you keep your remains in your tomb forever. His remains are nowhere to be found. There's not even a grave dug. And we know from Exodus that Joseph wanted his bones to be buried back in his homeland, back in Canaan. So far, we've got an archaeological backup for what you just said. So please continue.
Okay. Yeah, so there are obvious evidence of the Exodus story, Joseph being there. And yeah, it does say in it is Deuteronomy where they take the bones of Joseph with them, just like he wanted, and he is buried in somewhere in Israel, like Joseph's tomb. Anyway, Joseph is second in command in Egypt. He is saving the nation from famine. His family, his brothers who sold him into slavery, arrive in Egypt, leads to a restoration of the family, a reconciliation. Jacob is brought to Egypt as well to live with Joseph, and it says that Pharaoh gave them the land of Goshen to live in. That whole thing started by when Joseph was alive, and that happened. About 70 people probably in that family, including all the kids and grandkids and everything that moved down to escape the famine. They stayed there, and the Bible says they stayed there for over 400 years, and actually lived with great favor in relationship with the Egyptians. But then the Bible says that a couple hundred years passed, and they fell out of favor, and the Egyptians began to resent the prosperity of Jacob's family. And
isn't that a timeless tale? Semitics move in, become the upper class financially, then fall into disfavor because of that.
Yeah, for sure. And so they started to persecute, which led to enslavement of Jacob's very large family. And his family grows and grows, and despite the slavery and despite the oppression, and probably over 1 million people by the time that Moses is born. Moses born an Israelite, but then through a series of events ends up being adopted into Pharaoh's family himself.
And then hold on, just to interject the archaeology for what you just said. There's evidence that at some point the wealthy merchant class of Semitic peoples in the land of Goshen, the northern delta region in Egypt, became enslaved. So, for example, there's a papyrus called the Brooklyn Papyrus from the 13th dynasty. Records it's a wealthy Egyptian household's list of servants, all Semitic names. When you look at the bones of the buried Semitic peoples of that time, there's a few things that go on. They have what's called Harris lines in their bones. Now, when you have malnutrition as a child, your bone growth, your growth plates in your long bones stop and start. So you see these ridges on an X-ray or upon evaluation, like an archaeologist would. There's also a sign that the age of death. Sorry, that's for a later thing.
Yeah.
So
sorry.
Keep going.
Doesn't it in the archaeological evidence in Goshen? Isn't like even the archaeology of the the villages and the towns and the homes and everything markedly different from Egyptian archaeology as well.
Yeah, the households in Avaris,
Yeah.
which later became known as the city of Ramses,
Right.
hundreds of years later, bears the burial practices of the Semitic peoples, the type of weaponry they had,
Right.
and like we said earlier. So yes,
Yeah, the houses themselves even don't.
Syrian style.
Yeah,
Yes.
they're much different. So yeah, you see that all over where the Jewish people end up going. They build these cities, and you get these little places that
Yeah.
look different from everything else.
Yep.
And it just keeps, like you said, it just keeps playing out this way over and over again.
Correct.
Anyway, so Moses, we're at Moses, right? So
Yep.
Moses is born, ends up growing up in Pharaoh's household as one of an adopted son, basically, of Pharaoh. God gets a hold of him, and when he's an old man, he sends him back into Egypt because Moses flees Egypt at one point. Moses is an old man. God calls him. That's the whole burning bush story. You need to go set my people, my Jacob's kids, free because I promised Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob some things, and I'm not going to let them die enslaved in Egypt. Moses, you need to go to Egypt and tell Pharaoh to let my people go, is what he says to Moses. And Moses, of course, says, I don't think so. That's not going to work very well. I can't do it. I can't talk. They're not. He comes up with a litany over and over of all the reasons why this isn't going to work very well. God, you need to think through your plan a little bit more. And of course, that's not how it goes. And God gives Moses the exact instructions of how this is going to work. You're going to take your brother Aaron. You're going to go to my people, and you're going to say this, and you're going to go to Pharaoh, and you're going to say that, and it becomes very clear that the plan is that Pharaoh is not going to listen, and he's not going to let my people go. And so I am going to express my displeasure with Pharaoh in some very, let's say, new ways, like, dramatic ways.
The 10 plagues.
And he begins to unleash consequences each time Pharaoh refuses his request. Moses goes to Pharaoh with a request, let my people go. No. Okay. Well, then God starts to do some things. I don't know if you want to go through all of these things, but...
Well, I mean, there's the 10 basic plagues.
Yeah, so first
and don't they have significance? The ones God chose, like the Nile turning to blood, frogs everywhere, don't they have to touch upon, it's almost like a finger in the eye by God to the gods of Egypt.
The gods of Egypt. Yeah, some are more clear than others.
Yep.
And some are more culturally gods, like, you know what I mean, cultural
Yep.
worship rather than actual, like, religious worship.
Right.
You know how in our culture
But it
we
spoke to their
worship
culture
yeah,
and
we
religion of
worship
that time.
possessions and materialism.
Yes.
Right? Not necessarily a god that we carved and sits
Right.
on our mantle.
Yep.
Right? So it's the same kind of deal with Egypt. They have both their cultural gods and their religious gods, and and God is like, okay, well, if you think your gods are so great, how about you get them to stop me from getting my people out of your land here, right?
Yes.
And so he basically just keeps asking Pharaoh. Pharaoh keeps saying no, and our God, Yahweh, keeps on slamming into the Egyptians' concept of who's really in charge here.
Yes.
Right? Because this is really the question: who has the authority?
Yep.
Does Pharaoh have the authority, or does the God of Israel have authority?
Yeah, and there's an interesting thing. There's a couple of things that show up. There's a parchment known as the Admonitions of an Egyptian Sage. And he basically, this had been recorded around the time that this would have occurred. And it's basically him talking about the plagues hitting Egypt. And they're remarkably similar to what we see in Exodus. It talks about firstborn or people's children dying. It talks about an overrun of plagues and locusts and things like that. And then we also know there's a 3rd century BC Egyptian priest named Manetho, and he writes of the time which theologians and archaeologists will say this will be around the aftermath of the Jews leaving Egypt. But there's a record in the Egyptian records of a complete destruction of Egypt during the Middle Kingdom period. And that makes sense. If the slave class leaves, if millions of your slaves leave, and now all your supply chain is disrupted, your economy is crippled, and you're basically completely gutting your society, and that would completely weaken you economically. And plus, your whole army, according to Exodus, is drowned in one shot. You're in an extremely weakened state, like the barbarians invading Rome in the aftermath of their economic decline. You have a record of that within the Egyptian records, Manetho's records, that this happened around due to Moses' reign. And there's question as to when that was, but it puts it around the Middle Kingdom period. Now, we also know that from Exodus that the Pharaoh asked the midwives to kill every firstborn son of the Hebrews around the time of Moses.
Yeah, that's what Moses' birth back then. Yeah, they were trying to keep the population of the Hebrews down because God, even though his people were enslaved, he hadn't forgotten about them, and he's watching them, and he's growing them into a big kingdom and a prosperous one, and giving them lots of children, and that's what's happening. And so eventually the Egyptians are going like, "Wow, these people are going to overrun us if we don't do something."
Yes. Now, ironically, in the record of the deceased of that period, the Semitic people had there was a huge amount. Most people died before the age of 5 in this record, in this particular period.
Yep.
And in this same period, there was something like 30% less men than women, which does not happen naturally. So when you see that in the record, you're saying this sounds a lot like what would happen to the Semitic people, who are already now, we know from the archaeological record that they arrived and grew into a massive wealthy class, and then within a couple of hundred years, they dip into slavery. And then they you start seeing statistics of their of their bones and their burials and the diseases they had, the malnutrition. You start to see evidence of what would happen if what Exodus says happened, which is the firstborn's sons are in trouble. And I mean, in China, for example, girls were, they encouraged, for the last generation, they encouraged that people to abort their females in China, their one-child policy. And because they just said a one-child policy in China, but they chose to keep the man alive. And even within a whole generation of that policy, you have only about, it's a pretty big number to us, but there's almost 100 million Chinese men who could never get married now. So the number isn't, you would think that within a generation you'd have 50% less women when it's only, 10% less women. But you see an even greater gap for that for the Semitic peoples in this region. They have 30% less men than women, which never occurs naturally. So again, this backs up, everything we're talking about archaeologically does parallel with the Exodus story you're telling us.
And I think that there's archaeological evidence even for some of the actual individual plagues, or at least references to those things.
That's the Egyptian sage papyrus.
Yes. Because it looks like so the water of the Nile was turned to blood.
Yep, talks about that.
Right? You worship your Nile, because they were Nile worshippers for sure. Then it was frogs, and they did worship frogs. Gnats, I'm not too sure about exactly the connection to gnats, but there's a plague of gnats, a plague of flies, livestock being killed, boils on their bodies, hail, and locusts, and then darkness is what happened there. So,
and there's a bit of a continuity with some of those plagues. Like, for example, you have a massive overrunning of frogs. They're escaping the ponds and rivers and offshoots of the Nile because of the blood.
Yeah, makes sense.
How did God turn the Nile to blood? Could have been instantly supernaturally, or some sort of disease that rots fish, and they start bleeding out right there in the Nile. Now the frogs overrun the land. They die and rot. Gnats and flies come in. They carry the disease they love to bite cows. Cows are always flicking their tails to get the flies and the gnats off. They carry the disease of the frogs over to the cows, who then perish. And then now the locusts and the boils could have been an offshoot of the disease from the bovine diseases as well. And then the darkness, the hail, and the locusts, that would not be continuous biologically from that. But again, when you look at the admonitions of the Egyptian sage papyrus, you're seeing a lot of these types of things mentioned, and that's not standard fare. For a society.
Yeah, so I think there's plenty of evidence that this is an accurate story.
No, and then they carry on. Joshua is the Exodus, and Deuteronomy, Leviticus is the story of them after they leave Egypt. and survive in the desert for 40 years. Then they enter the promised land.
Right.
And then the book of Joshua takes over.
Right.
Now it's one of the first cities they destroy is Jericho. Now what's interesting is archaeologists have found evidence of a 2-part wall system around Jericho around that time. And it was destroyed suddenly, and there's a ton of there's charred remains there. And you could tell this didn't happen slowly because their pottery grains are full, right? So this happens right after the harvest, and all of a sudden everything gets destroyed and burnt. And so there's obviously some sort of conquest. Now, what does Joshua tells us? The walls crumbled, and then they set fire to the city and plundered it.
Yeah.
Ironically, because we know the story of Rahab and Joshua, right? This prostitute that makes a deal with the Israeli spies to spare her and her family. A German archaeologist, there's a section of the wall that never collapsed, right? Again, we can't prove anything. It doesn't say the word Rahab's house on a plaque in there.
Yeah, not a big neon sign. Rahab lives here. Yeah.
But you can at least say there's synchronicity here between the archaeological record and the events of our scriptures. And the closer you get to our timeline, like the New Testament, the more poignant and plentiful the archaeological records are for obvious reasons.
Yeah, for sure.
Now, the big question here is, the problem they've always had is there has to be major events occurring if Exodus physically occurred in reality. So you have to have the arrival and the growth of a Semitic population in northern Egypt.
Right.
Then there has to be a transition they go from the wealthy class, the favored class, to the disfavored class, literally the slave class. Then, boom, they leave Egypt in one shot, which again would collapse the Egyptian economy. And if the Red Sea drowned the entire Egyptian army, including Pharaoh, you have a very vulnerable population, a very vulnerable Egypt. And then the Jews move north and start to conquer the Promised Land. So far, so good in terms of the archaeological record. The problem is we've historically placed the time of Moses and therefore Joseph arriving in Egypt around the time of Ramses, because it says the city of Ramses.
Right.
But what you have to realize is that the Exodus calls it the city of Ramses, even when it's mentioning events in Joseph's time, which would have been hundreds of years before Ramses. So this is clearly written after the fact to talk about the events of the past, including Joseph's arrival. Now, at the time of Moses, if the archaeological records are followed, it would have been known as Avaris and not the city of Ramses. That would have come later.
Right.
And like I said, everything in the Mediterranean region, African region, and the Palestinian or Middle East region of that era, the 3, 2, and 1000s BC, all calibrated around Egyptology.
Yep.
What's interesting is when you look at the archaeological records of those places in the Mediterranean, in the Middle East, they've all been forced to have an artificial gap in them to move them to fit an estimated date for Egyptology. So now, if we triangulate Exodus, the natural archaeological records of Palestine and Greece and Egypt, and then take a look at one of the dark periods between the kingdoms in Egypt, they're estimated for how long they are. You have the Old Kingdom, the Middle Kingdom, and the New Kingdom. And in between those kingdom periods are what's called transitional or dark periods. They call them intermediate periods. If we reduce the intermediate period after the New Kingdom by a couple hundred years, 200 to 300 years, now all of a sudden everything matches up.
Yeah.
Archaeology in the region, Mediterranean, Palestinian, and Egyptian, the book of Exodus, and all the dates of the Egyptian records. So we may have to see a shift, and again, we're talking about Egyptologists who are non-Christian, who work in the field.
Yeah.
There is a debate as to how accurate their dating method is. Now, the standard school of thought goes with the old way of looking at things. But that's always the case until there's a revolution in any field. Geology didn't accept the idea of plate tectonics until the 60s, the 1960s. And it was started by a minority group of people who said, no, I think the Earth's crust is moving. And that was regarded as lunacy. And it was a minority view until the evidence accumulated and it overturned. Same with the Big Bang cosmology. The physics schools of Oxford, Cambridge, Yale, Harvard, 100 years ago literally taught that the physical universe was eternally existent. And that's obviously did not stand the test of time. A minority group of people in the 1910s began to say the evidence points to a time equals zero.
Yeah.
That if you go back in time, we literally come out of nothing and it introduced everything, space, time, and energy all at once. It was laughed at, it was derided, it was a minority view until it became the standard view.
Right.
Are we maybe seeing this in the Egyptological records? The answer is maybe.
Yeah.
And if we do see it, now we have a perfectly holistic combination of Mediterranean, Palestinian archaeology, Egyptology, and Exodus.
Yeah, yeah. I think if you just take the Bible as true and then look at the evidence that has been gathered today, right, on all these subjects, it all fits.
Yes.
Right. If you want to hold to that older timeline, then you can, but other things don't fit. Then it seems that when you take the records of Egypt and just read them for what they plainly say, and then you know, in the Palestinian area, Syria, and in where the Moabites and the Jordan is now, all of those countries the Israelites went through.
Yes.
And so there's lots of references to that particular thing of this large group of Semitic people traveling through. There's records, secular records of a large Semitic group of people moving into the land of Canaan there, the Canaanite region, and taking over and actually wiping out some of those peoples that live there.
Yep.
There's evidence for the Semitic people living in Egypt at a certain time and growing in power and being enslaved. Like, all of this is all lined up, and there is a perfectly reasonable explanation in Egyptology, but it's not the current accepted version of Egyptology.
Right. And people will say, why isn't there a record of such a massive event like in the official hieroglyphic structures on the pyramids and basically the state-sponsored trophy case that you see, because you see a history of them conquering people and things like that. And around at the time of Ramses, by the way, there is a monolith in Egypt that talks about the countries that they're at war with, and one of them is Israel. It literally says Israel and two other countries. I forget what they are. So Ramses' timeline could not have been the timeline of Israel not existing as a nation.
Yeah, right.
Why would you put your greatest embarrassment on your official trophy case? Because a lot of these hieroglyphic historical chronologies that you find in Egypt, state-sponsored, so the pharaoh says, thumbs up, I want you to put this on the wall. You're not going to put a major embarrassment on there. I mean, you go to an athlete's house, you don't see picture of them in their knockout losses. Their trophy case.
You got a wall full of their participation ribbons,
or just a shot of them getting hit and falling down and losing.
Yeah.
Highlight reel is what you get when you look at Egyptian hieroglyphics.
Yep, makes sense.
So it appears that, and the funny thing is, you look at Israel. Herodotus, who is the Greek historian, he wrote in I believe it was the 400s BC. Yeah, he lived from 484 to 425 BC. He's often considered the first historian in the world. Now, Homer would have written in the 900s BC, but he wrote a mixture of myth, lore, and history. Yeah. The style of history of Herodotus, where you're telling a story the way we're used to seeing history written. We take it for granted that kind of, if you pick up a history book about the Third Reich or the fall and rise of the Roman Empire, you're used to seeing the historical narrative of telling a story.
Yeah, yeah.
Herodotus is the first, quote unquote, considered the father of history. Ironically, about 1,000 or more years before him, we have the records of Moses, the 5 books of Moses, which is literally is our world's first historical narrative.
Yeah, yeah.
And people overlook that all the time because it's considered, scholars will always separate scripture from ancient literature out of bias.
Right.
They just don't accept that. But then we can apply the same archaeological test to the 5 books of Moses than we can to Herodotus's work.
Right.
And we find congruity.
Yeah, yeah, for sure. I think it's really interesting that one of the things that the Old Testament, the Pentateuch, the first 5 books of the Bible is rebuttal to the surrounding nations' religions, right? So sometimes people get, like, wow, Egypt wrote a story about the flood 1,000 years before Moses did, or the Sumerians were talking about this that happened in creation, and there's always this, and then when you read similar things in the Bible, sometimes people are like, well, that's just Bible, they're just retelling something older and they gave it a new flavor and everything. That's not what's happening there at all. It's God deciding to let's clear all this up.
Yes.
And no more what you think happened 1,000 years ago and how you think. Let me tell you, Moses, exactly what happened, and you write it down because I want to make sure everybody remembers.
Yes.
And so he uses the language of the surrounding nations' worldviews to give a correct worldview statement.
Yep.
Right? And so
and
I have no problem.
How else could he act? Like if we got a new revelation today to our time and age, God would meet us where we're at. So he'd use language we're familiar with. He wouldn't put a scientific concept way beyond our capacity to even know what he's talking about. He would use language familiar to us.
Right.
And still being accurate.
Totally. Well, it's because it's not. God didn't come down and create a desk and pen and start writing, right? He had Moses write it down.
Yes.
So Moses has to write how Moses knows how to write.
Yes.
Right? Moses is a guy who lives on this earth at a certain place at a certain time. He has to write within his ability to write.
Yep.
So he writes about the things that he knows,
Yep.
and the stories that he's heard and the religions that he's encountered.
Yep.
And then he writes by being inspired by God himself within to say what God wants said in the language, in the place at that time that this is writing is happening. It makes total sense. Of course he's going to talk about the things that everybody's talking about.
Yep. And I mean, like, the flood story is one of the most universal stories in the world.
And just because somebody wrote about it 500 years before Moses does not make anything Moses said untrue.
Correct.
Right?
Because all peoples clearly carry, because the Aborigines in Australia, the Indigenous in North America, the Chinese, everybody on Earth has a flood story. Now, if we take the flood story as, let's say, hypothetically, we'll take the flood story as a fact, which means you believe it is a fact. Noah survives the flood. They begin repopulating the earth. You're gonna one of the number one stories you'll tell your grandchildren as they sit on your lap is the flood.
Yeah.
Don't do that again, because God, will get angry. They take that with them on their migratory patterns across all of Earth, and like the telephone game. The details get muddled. The error, corruption comes in.
Right.
But there's clearly a flood account being carried around all the earth. So when you have the Genesis version of the flood story, you have a very specific amount of detail given. And yes, if God is meeting with Moses in the tent of meeting as a friend meets with a friend, like it says in Exodus, then can he not give you up-to-date information?
Sure.
Right?
And the point of it is not so much the details of, okay, exactly how did this work? What does it mean the fountains of the deep broke open? And did it really rain for 40 days and 40 nights? And how did this all happen? How could the waters cover the earth? Oh, those are all interesting, and I'm sure God has told us the truth about all of those things. But the real thing he was giving Moses to tell people was why. Why was there a flood?
Yep.
Right? That's the point. It wasn't a battle between the deities, and it wasn't an accident.
Right.
There was a purpose for what happened to Moses. Let me tell you what that was.
Yeah.
Right? So that's why the correction is needed and given. Is not just everybody agrees, okay, there's a flood. And God goes, okay, this is what happened. But here's why. Here's what I was doing in this. Here are the players in that story that I was talking to and interacting with. Here's the reasons why this happened. Right? That's the thing that the Bible brings to the story.
Absolutely. No, I mean, again, my whole some people's passion when they become believers is worship music. That's where we get worship people from. My passion ever since I've become a believer is to to see, appreciate, and communicate the rationality of our faith. That's just the way God made me.
Right.
And to me, I can't remember who said this. You probably remember. The heart cannot rejoice in what the mind rejects. Who said that again?
You did. I think you said that.
No, but I'm quoting somebody.
I don't know.
And that, I very much vibe with that. Like, once you start to see in archaeology, in history, in science, you start to see that the details we're given in our scriptures are the truth, right? Because a worldview, for it to be the correct worldview, has to be externally consistent with the outside world, or else it's just its own story. You know, Norse mythology says that when we look up at the sky, we're looking at the inside of a dead giant's skull, and the clouds are the remains of his brains. Pretty sure we can lay that one to rest.
Yeah.
But when you go to the scriptures, the Judeo-Christian scriptures, and you try and say this is mythology, I'm all fine for people trying to do that, because I want to know that what I believe is the truth all the way down the line. And that's my joy, and that's one of my joys in life. It's not just to know what the scriptures say and to commune with God, but it's to express to all other, to me, that emboldens Christians. To know that what you're believing is true makes it easier to obey it when the going gets tough, when the pressure's on, which us Western Christians have never felt real pressure for being Christians. We are the weakest Christians in history, just because we've never been tested. And as we might be going down into times that we think we're going into, potentially, of extreme testing, we're going to need to know that we're not relying on mythology or just a tale, a good set of fables.
Right, yeah.
This is God's revealed word about the real world, the world to come, the world that was, and the world that we're in.
Right.
And that is the purpose of these podcasts.
Yeah. It's everything in the Bible is so logical, right? When even the things that people say, oh, that doesn't make any sense, when you actually sit down and explain, everybody, oh, okay, that makes total sense, right? Even your thing about the city of Ramses was actually another name when actually the Israelites were there, right? And Moses called it the city of Ramses. Well, that makes total sense, because he uses the language that people know today. He doesn't use an arcane name. Because I grew up in southern Ontario, in a little town called Kitchener. Well, 20 years before I was born, or 30 years before I was born, it was called Berlin.
Well, just
right?
a real quick note on that is the later editions of, if the city of Ramses is not the city of, because it wouldn't have been the city of Moses' time either. It would have come a couple hundred years after, at least a couple hundred years after Moses. So the injection of the city of Ramses detail would have to have come from later editions of Moses' work.
Yeah, well, that's the point is Moses didn't necessarily write every single thing in the first 5 books of the Bible. It's obvious that Joshua collected some of it and wrote some of it as well, and we do not know who Moses had in his collection that he added into. There's some people that even say that Moses had in his possession writings of Adam to make some of the Genesis story from, right? So there's so many things we don't know, but it all becomes not a problem if we just realize that language is just usually pretty logical and the same, and we would use words that mean things to us today. Not things that were called a different name 50 years ago, because then everybody's like, what are you talking about? I don't know that place. Right? So people just talk plainly. And the Bible is so much like that once you start realizing it. I wanted to tell you that here's it, 2 Peter. For we did not follow cleverly devised myths, right, when we made known to you the power and coming of our Lord Jesus Christ, but we were eyewitnesses of his majesty, right? It goes on from there. That's the thing, the whole point. This isn't a myth. It can't be a myth, or it's not God's word.
Exactly.
Right? So when I tell people I believe the Bible and they think I just believe in Aesop's fables, you can believe that, but that is not what's happening here. These are not myths. These are not claimed to be myths. These are claimed to be truth, just like any other historical, archaeological book claims to be.
And Paul said, if Christ did not physically rise from the dead, we of all people are most to be pitied.
Yeah, because we're believing a lie then,
Correct.
right? And there's no hope.
Correct.
Yeah. So,
Well, thanks for joining us. That'll wrap up this session. Join us next time. Thank you very much.
bye.